So the good thing about this panel, of course, is that I don't have to reintroduce the panelists since they have already spoken. But still, as a way of introduction, I will now start with Esther. So I read about your work, and you call yourself a reparationist. And in your speech now, we followed your line of thought and also your activist movements in which you are. And you keep talking about reparation, although we know now, by now, after the Durban Declaration was not as successful as we know, and especially Western countries kind of like shut down when they hear the word of reparation, so that people don't really believe there is something to be repaired or that will ever come. So how do you define your title or your function as reparationist? What is there else to demand than demanding that reparation must come?
Well, reparations is something that, as I said, has two dimensions, the external and the internal. And the external is what often gets focused on in terms of what other nations have or should be doing for us to correct the damage. What doesn't get focused enough on, I think, is the what's called the internal, the self-repairs, the African self-repairs, which is the process by which we even can compel others to do what they have to do. And that is about rebuilding up our power base to actually affect our will as a people, locally, nationally, and internationally, and especially in the international arena. So that's what I would say in terms of reparations. And I define myself as a reparationist because my work is really largely about education, consciousness raising, and advocacy to promote and defend and advance the cause of what we in PARCO call Pan-African reparations for global justice. And what that really speaks to is the fact that we cannot have true global justice without reparatory justice. And that reparatory justice for African people is a foundational, outstanding cause that we have to be the drivers of as African people.
Yes, and the decade actually asks for this. The decade, even in the preamble, it says that, in the resolution of the decade, it says that no measure should be taken by state authorities, because the decade speaks to states. They should implement it. But no measures ought to be taken by states without a consultation of people of African descent and civil society. So would you be kind of like happy with like a moral appeal to reparation in terms that states actually kind of formulate the will?
No, a moral will is not sufficient. It's a legal principle, and the states that are not honouring and implementing even sections of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action are actually breaking the law in some respects. And so we have this huge issue where the justice, the long-standing justice demands of African peoples, both at home and abroad, are denied. So it's like we haven't fully recovered our full humanity in the eyes of the rest of the world, who deny us our right to be repaired and to repair ourselves, and to be unhindered from doing that. So a lot of the time when we are trying to repair ourselves, there are many barriers that get put in place to prevent us from coming together, to prevent us from organising in a self-determined way, even the continued dismemberment of African families and communities through immigration measures that prevent families from even being together. So these are some of the continuities that we're still experiencing. And states have obligations under international law to implement the law irrespective of who the population group are.
Exactly, and also irrespective of how many they are. Because this is a question I received many times from the German government. How many people are they? Maybe we can do a lot more. It sounds a bit like we will do more if there will be many. And as you said, it's a human rights principle regardless of the size of this population. So, Biram, I will speak to you in English, and of course we have translation here. So, you are a human rights activist, and you fight for the rights of enslaved people in Mauritania. And I think at the first thought, people are a bit surprised, because we all know Mauritania is in Africa. The international decade speaks to the diasporized communities and their rights. Now it seems that we have in Mauritania, as in other parts of the African continent, a diasporized community within African countries. So how do we solve it, or how do we explain this reality? How about enslavement on the African continent?
Bon, le germe est la source de cette possibilité pour le régime mauritanien de perpétuer un racisme anti-noir, une oppression des personnes d'ascendance africaine de manière systématique, et perpétuer aussi un esclavage antique et ancestral. En Mauritanie, dans un pays au cœur de l'Afrique, sans être inquiété, la source de tout ça, ce sont les lois de l'Union africaine. Les lois qui protègent les régimes et qui ne protègent pas les populations, qui protègent les dictateurs, les chefs d'État et qui ne protègent pas les populations. Il y a le droit à la non-ingérence. C'est le club des chefs d'État africains qui, dès le début, avec ça, ils ont ratifié la décision du Congrès de Berlin en 1882 qui divisait l'Afrique, qui morcelait l'Afrique, qui affaiblissait l'Afrique à jamais. À l'OEA, à Addis Abeba, ils ont intégré ça, ils ont repris ça à leur compte, les chefs d'État, pour encore reproduire cette division perpétuelle de l'Afrique et pour reproduire avec le principe de non-ingérence dans les affaires intérieures d'un État pour protéger tous les régimes avec leurs exactions. C'est pourquoi nous nous indignons contre cette indignité sélective des Africains. Pourquoi les Africains se sont indignés contre ce qui s'est passé en Afrique du Sud, l'apartheid, et l'ont combattu? Pourquoi? Il y a plusieurs apartheid, il y a plusieurs esclavages, il y a plusieurs colonialismes. Ce n'est pas seulement le colonialisme de l'homme blanc, l'esclavagisme de l'homme blanc et l'apartheid de l'homme blanc qui doivent être combattus. Ce sont tous les colonialismes, notamment le colonialisme arabo-musulman, l'esclavagisme arabo-musulman, l'apartheid arabo-musulman qui sévissent en Mauritanie. Bon, il n'y a pas lieu d'accepter cette solidarité tiers-mondiste, cette solidarité continentale, cette solidarité confessionnelle avec certains régimes et certains peuples qui perpétuent l'oppression des personnes d'ascendance africaine. Je pense que les Africains, l'Union africaine, a été solidaire dès le début avec le régime d'apartheid implanté en Afrique de l'Ouest, en Mauritanie, qui est un apartheid arabo-berbère, arabo-musulman, et s'est focalisé sur un apartheid européen, indo-chrétien, un apartheid occidental qui était implanté en Afrique du Sud. Mais ce que nous ressentons de manière très mal, nous, la diaspora noire dans le monde arabo-musulman, c'est cette sélectivité que les Africains s'indignent quand les opprimés les oppresseurs sont blancs, indo-européens, occidentaux, et les Africains sont beaucoup moins indignés, sinon silencieux ou complices, quand l'oppresseur est arabo-musulman. Voilà, bien que nous considérons que l'oppression indo-européenne, occidentale pour les Noirs, mérite encore beaucoup de combats, beaucoup d'engagement, et ne mérite pas une trêve, car rien n'est encore réglé. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. And I think at this point, maybe sometimes I say it and I receive very surprised faces because the decade being on African descent, it says it's not a decade for Africans. It's a decade for people of African descent, and by that focusing on the diasporization of Africans and the realities they faced after they were diasporized, without meaning that, of course, the history on the continent is left out. But still, in political terms, it means that the decade does focus outside of Africa. And so the case of Mauritania and other countries make it very difficult, actually, because there seems to be a barrier in terms of where the states have said, here and not further. And while it's a milestone for the first time in history that actually we are not only looking at Africa in terms of development aid, now it's about us in the diaspora. This kind of intersectionalities also, in terms of experiences, make it difficult actually to disconnect the decade from Africa. So I continue to Esther, and then also afterwards, of course, we want you to come into the discussion. That's why I will not ask many questions to the panelists. So Esther, listening to you, and also the demands that you have made for the decade. Of course, I'm very delighted because I think you are a source of knowledge to me. Also, while I was sitting there listening, I was like, oh my God, this I knew, this I didn't know, oh, I'm learning. So thank you very much for that. But you made a very strong demand. So part of my ear is always the decade ear, knowing all the articles. And one of your demands made me kind of like, oh my God, what is she talking about? What? Which you said, the diaspora having a right to the continent, a right to Africa, a right to be consulted, a right to be, not only to be consulted, but a right also to participate in the development and events of the continent. So the backlash of this, of course, from a decade perspective, and also of these people who always say, we have diaspora and we have Africa. So how do you deal with it in terms of like, should the diaspora not more find its own platforms, its own reality, as opposed to claiming the continent? Does it clear?
Yeah, I think I understand your question, but no, in short, I don't see how diasporas, African diasporas in particular, can think that we're just going to carve out some island here or some special place in Europe or wherever we are dispersed, and think that somehow that can be done in isolation from Africa as a continent and our people who are still in Africa. You know, this is absurd to me. I don't understand why even that thinking should be present in some of our minds. And it speaks to the problematic nature, I think, of some diaspora communities who end up actually sometimes being used against their very source, their home countries and the policies. And we're seeing that a lot with some sections of the African diaspora in Europe who end up going back home and selling some of these bad ideas and ideas around maldevelopment to our people. So that's one of the weaknesses, I believe, of the Decade program. And given the fact that a lot of these ideas originally came from African people, African movements and struggles, non-governmental structures. However, when they get implemented and taken on board by state actors and by international organizations, they often change, okay? And that's because of the nature of those international organizations. And I think the United Nations, in particular, has a very checkered history. At the same time, whilst we've used it to speak to the world about our cause, it has also been very problematic in our history. So we must not, I think, just stop at the UN. I recognize that for those who work in UN structures, who are doing good work, that they need to be supported, but we have to remember these are autonomous community agendas that we need to maintain. I think the initiative, we need to maintain the direction. Otherwise, what could have started out as being a very good proposal could end up being something that ends up causing more division amongst us because it has been incompletely framed. And we have to also recognize how the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action came about, largely because of the input of Africans in the Americas, South and Central Americas, the over 250 plus million people of African heritage who classify themselves as Afro-descendants. Now, because of the historical separation of some of those populations from the motherland, it's understandable why they, as a significant group and power block, in the Americas have fashioned, I think, some of these good initiatives in the way that they have. But that is why I was suggesting that we need to take a Pan-African perspective, because there's the rest of the African family. And we have to get back to a place where we are organizing in this global way, where we can talk to each other across our linguistic and cultural and ethnic barriers and even tensions, and actually fashion a way that is going to be in the best interests of our people, taking on board our history and also where it is that we must end up and where we envision ourselves to be as Africans in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Of course, your points are very valid, and I think the direction I had with the question is also that knowing all what you said and, of course, taking it in. For example, we have a very strong issue with identification. Who is people of African descent? And especially, I see it as an activist, and we have seen it now in Latin America, especially in the Caribbean, that although that now that the Pan-African movements and that the decade is growing bigger. Actually, I think it was recently in Brazil that Brazil has recorded the highest number of African descendants in the country, now being, after Nigeria, the second biggest country with a black population in the world. But we assume that this population has not been growing just in the past few years. We assume this population has been there. But actually that it made a difference what people are starting now to cross on the list in terms of identification. We see the situation in Venezuela where apparently almost, I think, African descendants almost non-existent because people don't identify themselves as such. So I think we should also look into it. How do we intensify the identification as African people?
Yes, and we must also recognize that as African people, however we self-define, because we don't always self-define as being African, that we're going through a process of what's called ethnogenesis. And ethnogenesis is really how a group of people come to see themselves as being ethnically distinct. And it's also where you have a population of people who might go by another identity, such as a colonial identity, and are experiencing a rediscovery of their ancestral culture and lineages and heritage and language and so forth, and are trying to include some of that in their own personal identity development and group development, but they are at the same time eclipsed by a more powerful group that dominates them politically, culturally, and ideologically. So we are a people who are in the process of rebirth and rediscovery of who we are, including the diaspora scattered across the four corners of the earth. And we're only now beginning to rediscover just how deep that African root and history and lineage and identity has gone. Because many of our people today, they could be in Asia, they could be in India, wherever, but they are now rediscovering that ancient African ancestral connection and are taking pride in that. So as I said, the Africa of yesterday is not the Africa that will be of tomorrow, and that we are recreating now on the basis of what we now know about each other and the journeys that we have taken.
And I think an important issue of the decade is also to encourage this pride into the history and also, of course, of our heroes, unsung heroes, so to say. My last question goes to Biram, then we open the questions to you. The microphone? No. Yeah. Ich kann was anderes geben. Yes, so Biram. You have talked about your struggle and, of course, of the fight of your organization. And I have witnessed the work of your organization at the United Nations, also in Geneva, and especially in the minority forums, where you are also present. And we have just spoken about the response also of your government, especially when they meet the non-governmental organization in such international fora. So it seems you don't only focus on national level, but you also want to bring the struggle and the realities to the international forum. So my question is, what would you say to us, and even your advice, because you also called every one of us to engage with this story and also to engage with the wider African diaspora in the Islamic world, what would be the advice for you to ask, how can we support your cause?
Je pense que pas mal de personnes ici ont aussi des expériences assez fortes qui peuvent aussi être très utiles pour une feuille de route qui doit nous guider, nous tous, et qui doit nous faire profiter de cette décade dans laquelle les Nations Unies nous accompagnent. Bon, je pense que les luttes doivent se transformer en lutte générale et globale, comme la globalisation des médias, la globalisation des droits de l'homme. Il doit y avoir aussi la globalisation des luttes des peuples d'ascendance africaine et des personnes d'ascendance africaine. Je considère, moi, que ce concept est très, très voisin des situations des Africains eux-mêmes sur le continent africain. Je ne pense pas que se focaliser sur la diaspora seule, en laissant en rade l'Afrique, je pense que ça, ce sera un handicap et ce sera même un début de l'échec. Parce que comme vous l'avez vu dans le film qui a été projeté tout à l'heure, les jeunes noirs sud-africains, ce ressentiment qu'ils ont fait ressortir au cours du film, je pense que c'est le ressentiment que ressortirait un jeune noir aussi à New York, à Chicago, à Washington DC, un jeune noir à Nouakchott, ma ville, la capitale de la Mauritanie, un jeune noir à la Mecque, en Arabie Saoudite, où j'étais là-bas tout de suite, un jeune noir. Ici encore, dans certaines villes européennes. Je pense que nous pouvons aussi penser que les Africains, certains Africains, beaucoup d'Africains, à cause de la malgouvernance et de l'oppression qu'ils subissent de la part de leurs gouvernants, sont aussi de la diaspora ou des exilés ou des déportés dans leur propre pays. Les ressentiments sont voisins, donc moi je pense que la globalisation de la lutte, la concertation, mais je vois que Ici, la diaspora peut bénéficier de beaucoup d'instruments, notamment des médias, notamment des contacts avec, sans avoir à être réprimé, à être emprisonné, à être inquiété, les contacts avec les organisations et les organismes internationaux comme les Nations Unies à New York, ici à Genève, un peu partout, et d'autres encore bureaux, par rapport aux Africains qui ont des difficultés de parler aux médias, qui ont des difficultés de parler aux fonctionnaires internationaux, qui ont des difficultés de s'organiser à cause de la répression. La Mauritanie est interdite. Moi, je pense qu'il doit y avoir un organisme supranational, supracontinental, auquel les gens doivent réfléchir et qui doit canaliser tous ces ressentis, toutes ces expériences pour en faire un instrument puissant pour aller à la conquête des droits sur le continent et dans la diaspora. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. I think we got the message.